Randal Rauser. Welcome to the podcast.
Great to be here again, Miles. Thanks for having me back.
Of course, I was going to say you need to bring out your CV once again and prepare to update it because you are the first person to appear on this podcast not once, not twice, three times. That's crazy. Congratulations, Randall. That's awesome.
Yes, I do appreciate that. That is quite the accolade. So I'll put that right up there with my current job title and my PhD.
I'd put it at
Excellent.
the top, to be honest with you.
I would. Yeah.
So, we're here to talk about American evangelicalism and its relationship to politics. The evangelical movement, broadly speaking, is a particular segment of Christian religious practice, primarily focused in the United States, I believe, and it might be its only location. But let's begin broadly. What is an evangelical? What do they believe? Go from there.
That's a more difficult question than one might suppose initially, actually. So, I would suggest big picture, if you want to define what's an evangelical, you could start with David Bebbington's definition. So he's a historian, and he looked at the history of evangelicalism dating back to its origins. And its origins are typically dated from a historical perspective to the 18th century, to the rise of Wesleyan Methodism and a kind of second blessing theology. There was a real focus there at that time on a living, vital, personal Christian faith. John Wesley himself famously looked for evidence of his own conversion until he had a heart strangely warmed. That for him became the validation of his faith. And that is this idea that became very influential in evangelicalism, which relates to these really four areas that David Bebbington, the historian, identifies. So he says evangelicals have a strong focus on conversion, what he calls conversionism. So the idea that you need to have a living faith, often marked by knowing the day of your conversion. Now, that's not a necessity, but a very strong emphasis upon a living, vibrant Christian faith, the emphasis on making new converts. And that leads to activism as well. So being active in your evangelism of others, also to biblicism. So a very strong emphasis on the authority of the Bible in all manners of theology and often in all manners of life. And crucicentrism, so an emphasis on the atoning work of Christ, and that's central to the Christian's proclamation to the world. Now, having said that, those categories are broad enough that they could describe many non-evangelical groups as well. So the next thing I would say is that evangelicalism as an American phenomenon really is birthed in the wake of the 1920s, when there was this conflict in American Protestantism between the mainline Protestants, who were increasingly viewed as liberals by the conservative Protestants. And the conservatives came to be known as the Fundamentalists because they were centered on a group of pamphlets written in the 19 teens, which were meant to summarize what they understood to be the fundamentals of faith that had largely been lost and overlooked by the mainline liberal Protestants. And central to this was a debate, among other things, about evolution and rejecting evolution and establishing creationism. So the fundamentalists began as this new movement reacting against the liberals, and they founded their own subculture, including their own Bible schools and institutions. But there were conservative Christians who felt alienated both by the fundamentalists and the liberals, and those became the evangelicals in the modern American sense. They founded a group called the National Association of Evangelicals in 1942. They still have a statement of belief, and they have a few dozen member organizations or denominations that are part of the NAE. And so they've sort of been a witness for the broader evangelical movement. It's also closely related through the 1950s and 60s with certain institutions like Fuller Theological Seminary, with the preaching of Billy Graham in particular, with Christianity Today magazine. Those are sort of standard evangelical institutions. In the 1970s and 80s, to some degree, I think there was some melding of fundamentalists and evangelicals, and that's sort of going to bring us into our current conversation, where they became highly politicized together, increasingly associated with the Republican Party, and that's sort of been the story for the last 45 years.
So Originally, I think I missed the point of departure from fundamentalists to evangelicals in the first half of the 20th century. Did they emerge from fundamentalists? Did fundamentalists reject the evangelicals? What was the precise relationship initially?
It was more. I mean, I suspect what you'd really find looking back is that there were some people who came out of the mainline liberal tradition, and some who came out of the fundamentalist tradition, and maybe some who just never affiliated with either one of those traditions. And the lot of them just found themselves increasingly alienated from all of these positions. But I think one influential book that was written in 1947 by probably considered the preeminent American evangelical theologian in the middle 20th century, who was Carl Henry. So he wrote this book called The Uneasy Conscience of Modern Fundamentalism in 1947, and that became a kind of manifesto for evangelicals to say we're not fundamentalists, because fundamentalists denigrate the life of the mind, to put it bluntly, and they want to pull out of culture and have nothing to do with culture, just establish their own institutions and wait for the end of the world, essentially. And we don't want to do that. We want to affirm the life of the mind. We want to be engaged in culture and with culture. And that became more the evangelical project. But again, fundamentalism changed in the 1970s, the end of the 1970s, as it shifted from being this countercultural force that was withdrawing from society to becoming one that was increasingly mobilized to seek political power and recognition in wider society. And that's where evangelical and fundamentalist interests, I think, began to blur together in the late 1970s.
Right. Okay. So then carry us forward from then on. The fundamentalists and the evangelicals unite under the broad framework and name evangelical. And what happens from then on?
Well, so initially there was a foundation. It's 1980. Ronald Reagan, who's running for president against Jimmy Carter. And let me just say, I'm not a historian. So, this is my armchair history as a systematic theologian. But he's running for president, and he's appealing to the conservative Christians and evangelicals, which is interesting because Jimmy Carter was an evangelical, and 1976 was called the year of the evangelical, which sort of gave birth to his own presidency, and then he became elected and assumed the presidency in 77. But in the course of his term, he ended up losing the evangelicals. And there were several reasons for that. One reason was that abortion, being anti-abortion or pro-life, became one catalyzing issue. Another, like school choice and like an emphasis on private schools, which was in part a reaction to the integration of the schools, because part of the conservative Christian movement has been a link to white supremacy historically. So that was a factor. Of course, a collapsing economy in the late 1970s in much of the West, including in the U.S. And then just things like the Iran, the hostages, and Jimmy Carter's failure to get the hostages back. All of these things meant that Reagan then appealed to the evangelicals and fundamentalists as a voting bloc of conservative Christians. And there was a group formed called the Moral Majority, led by people like Jerry Falwell and Pat Robertson, who really marshaled the forces of evangelicals and fundamentalists to get Reagan elected. And he was indebted to them. And it was kind of this quid pro quo, a this for that thing, that through their support for the Republican Party now reciprocated by prioritizing the interests of evangelicals. One other thing I would note is, I think it's fair to say, because a large portion of the evangelical movement was influenced by dispensationalism, which believed that the establishment of the State of Israel in 1948 constituted the reestablishment of the kingdom of God through a modern Israel and the fulfillment of prophecy specifically, and toward the end of the world, that there was this very strong support among evangelicals through that influence of dispensationalism for the State of Israel, and its support, and it's providing military and intelligence support for them to establish themselves. And so that was, I think, a significant influence as well from the conservative and Republican side.
Okay, good. That helps tie together then the Republican Party in general and the evangelical movement. their interests were aligned for a time, and then they just became intertwined because of that initial quid pro quo, as you put it. And that is, it's interesting. You connect it to this broader theology of dispensationalism. That is the religious movement within which I grew up. One defined by rapture theology and young earth creationism were two pretty clear defining features of my childhood, because there was such a strong emphasis placed upon those beliefs, particularly young earth creationism, as something we needed to defend against secular educational institutions. What is the broad demographics of young earth creationists among evangelicals? This is an offshoot, but I'm just curious. Is it still the case that a majority of evangelicals would identify with this view that the earth is only 6,000 or so years old?
I'm not reliable on this. The last time I just have a statistic in my mind that approximately one third of, I think it's one third of Americans believe the Earth is young, like 6 to 10,000 years old. But that could be a very dated statistic, so I wouldn't give that any credence. I would say, just generally speaking, I mean, clearly, young Earth creationism was hugely influential in this conservative Protestantism. I grew up in a dispensational Pentecostal tradition. Other dispensationalists were cessationists. They believed that there were no spiritual gifts extant today, supernatural spiritual gifts. And so they considered Pentecostals to be out to lunch. So these groups didn't like one another at all. But in other respects, they shared the same dispensational theology. And so we had the same subculture of the Institute for Creation Research, and then later Answers in Genesis, the Ken Ham organization, and people like Dwayne Gish, who went around debating atheists and others of biologists at university campuses. So I grew up in that subculture in the 70s and 80s. And I actually, in 1986, I remember I gave my, or 87, I gave my high school science teacher a copy of the book It's a Young Earth After All, I think, or It's a Young World After All. And yeah, kind of still wince from that.
Oh, I understand. I really do. So, moving into the present day, Donald Trump has a strong base of support among evangelicals. And I have two statistics here that'll be a good jumping off point for us. According to the Pew Research Center, quote, overall, 2/3 of white evangelical Protestants say they have a favorable view of, and this is phrasing from prior to the election, of the former president, including 30% who have a very favorable opinion of him. Further, around 8 in 10 Republican voters identify with a Christian denomination, compared with 60% of all registered voters. The largest religious group among Republicans is white evangelical Protestants, who make up 30% of GOP registered voters. So, the question I have is, what accounts for the evangelical support for Donald Trump? Before I even get into why that might be problematic, or why we might ask that question, what explains the connection between Donald Trump, who he is, and his support among evangelicals specifically?
Well, I think first of all, again, for the last 45 years of an entire generation or two of evangelicals, particularly white evangelicals, have been told that the Republican Party is the party that Christians vote for and that Christians identify with. So whoever's the head of that party is de facto, that's just the person you support. So I think that's just the first thing right there, is that when he identified as the Republican, when he became the nominee in 2016, then the result was, this is the guy that we as Christians support. And I think just in terms of psychology there, what happens is people rationalize over time. So for example, like I remember, I think it was Norman Geisler, so a well-known conservative theologian, initially opposed Trump, and he, and I think also Wayne Grudem, like they were negative, another well-known Protestant fundamentalist theologian. They were very opposed to Trump initially. And I think, like, particularly when the Access Hollywood video came out in October of 2016, Trump is depicted as bragging about sexual assault of women. which of course fit very well with the fact that 24 women accused him of having groped them or assaulted them, and in retrospect that he's since been convicted, not convicted, but on a balance of probabilities found to be an adjudicated sexual abuser in a civil court. So when you put all that together, then they were initially opposed to him and repulsed by him, but eventually I think the sort of, you'd call it tribalism, took over, and then they rationalized it, and then many of them doubled down and even became stronger. So some of these people like James Dobson, who I grew up being associated with family values, have been among the most vociferous and unrelenting and unapologetic of Trump apologists, which is just an extraordinary thing, because here's a person who's like the least pro-family one could imagine. I can talk all day about that alone if you like, but obviously a man who's cheated on his first two wives, well, and his third wife. He's cheated on all his wives, and with multiple different women, and sexualizes his own daughters. I mean, it's just, he's a grotesque human being. His conduct is reprehensible, and yet you have people like Dobson defending him, and so you could get into a whole conversation about that as well. But yeah, so there's that. And I think one other thing I would just add importantly, well, actually two things. Let me say two things. So one thing is abortion in particular. Trump has promised to get, and he did. He delivered on getting pro-life members onto the Supreme Court, and he got Roe v. Wade overturned, and that was a huge thing for many evangelicals who are functionally single-issue voters. The only issue they vote on is whether the candidate is viewed to be pro-life. Now, in retrospect, that's pretty stark when you consider the fact that Trump is a big supporter, professes to be of IVF, which for people who believe life begins at conception functionally results in the death of untold numbers of embryos, fertilized embryos. And then the second thing is he nominates and then forces through RFK Jr. as the new HHS secretary when that guy was supporting Roe v. Wade when he was running for president 1 year ago. So there's a kind of incongruity there, we'll say. One more quick thing is I think there's frankly a lot of xenophobia among evangelicals, and there's a really strong desire to establish a Christian nationalist vision, so a Christian nation. And Trump is very strong on immigration, against immigrants, against Muslims. Of course, in his first term, he had a Muslim ban, one of the first things he did when he assumed the presidency, which these evangelicals view generally as a very positive thing, because this is a Christian nation, and so he's limiting the immigration of Muslims, and then limiting the immigration of, frankly, brown people on the southern border. The degree to which there's been not only an absence of pushback on his xenophobic and racist rhetoric and othering rhetoric against marginal immigrant groups is horrifying. And I think that's pretty telling about the state of contemporary evangelicalism.
I agree with you entirely. And I think the only point I would add is that it is all the more incongruent when one realizes that Donald Trump, in addition to all of the moral failings you've listed, is a pathological liar. And to me, it seems undeniable for someone who listens to him for more than 30 seconds. There's even a Wikipedia page called False or Misleading Statements by Donald Trump, which records literally tens of thousands of statements that President Trump has made over the last 10 years, estimating about 27 per day. And that seems right. If you've listened to him, if you've watched his speeches, that adds up, that checks out. And the question then is, how do evangelicals resolve the incongruity between their claimed biblical values and the man that they vote for? Because it's not like these moral failings are subtle in the background, in the fine print. They are up front and center of who this man is. Now, obviously, there's a sense in which certain biblical values are championed in this man if you think he supports the pro-life position, for example. But in a deeper sense, at least people outside the evangelical tradition see the broad contours of the New Testament emphasis on love and compassion and the fruit of the Spirit, as the Apostle Paul would say, and of the perceived character of Jesus Christ. And they think, okay, evangelicals support that vision of a way to live one's life. And then there's Donald Trump, who aligns with none of that. So how can evangelicals support this man? What do you think is the validity of that line of inference from those who stand outside the evangelical tradition? Where have they gone wrong in inferring these things?
Like in asking how can they support this man?
Given the perceived New Testament ethic that these evangelicals claim to support, it just seems like they have come to a place where those issues are just irrelevant. And I wonder why.
Okay, so I'm going to just throw out three things here, just at the top of my head. First thing is, I think what this reflects is in our contemporary social media landscape, the degree to which everybody is being siloed in terms of the amount of type of information they're getting. So we're all in information bubbles. And the algorithms feed back to us the things we click on. And, if you spend all day on Fox News and then in an algorithm created information bubble on Facebook and Twitter/X and YouTube, you're going to get a particular view of the world. And you're simply not going to be exposed to the kind of information that would create the cognitive dissonance that challenge who you've been told Donald Trump is. As an example, just today, so this is on the top of the news, there was a major security breach, and Jeffrey Goldberg, I believe his name is, so a reporter for The Atlantic, was pulled in, given top secret information about a planned bombing campaign that Pete Hegseth and the military were planning. So the degree of the security breach is just off the charts. And yet I saw a clip on Fox News of one of the Fox News commentators attempting to spin this as a positive story when Fox News spent years covering a security breach from Hillary Clinton's server, her private server, and yet this is orders of magnitude more serious than that, and yet there's an attempt to spin it. So if that's where you're getting your information from, you will just never be challenged and experience a cognitive dissonance. And you won't think that Trump is a liar because you're not going to the Wikipedia page that lists 17 or 27 lies a day for the last 10 years. So that's a huge problem. And that's a problem you're seeing in countries around the world. I can talk about the same kinds of things, for example, in South Korea, where the degree of polarization is equivalent to what you find in the US. And increasingly where I live here in Canada, it's the same kind of thing, that there's a increased polarization. And of course, it's all the algorithms feed rage. So they want, the more people are angry, the more engaged they are in the algorithms, the more they click on information content. And so it just feeds contempt for one another. So that's one huge thing. The second thing I would say is that for many people, it's a pragmatic justification and a rationalization. So they're saying, look, yes, Donald Trump is a bad person. I don't like him personally, but he did get this. He's pro-life. He's fighting on the border. He's better than the Democrats because the Democrats are democrats, right? Essentially, it's like pure evil embodied in the Democrats. And if that's the alternative is pure evil, well, then Trump is the better of options. So that's the second thing, is you get a rationalization from some people. The last one is in some respects the craziest one. And this is people who view Donald Trump as a prophetic figure with God's hand upon him. This is a feature of the New Apostolic movement in particular, which is a charismatic movement that is latched on to Donald Trump as part of their view of fulfilled prophecy. And just some of like the conversation about his life being spared in this assassination attempt last summer just gives you a sense of some of that stuff. So there are people that believe like Donald Trump is God's anointed. And for them, again, it's like he can do no wrong.
Yes. So I was just Googling to get the details, but it reminds me of an episode on Capturing Christianity where where Cameron Bertuzzi was interviewing a New Testament scholar whose name I forget, or theologian. And this theologian was seriously considering the case that we have a strong argument for seeing miraculous intervention behind behind the failed assassination attempt on Donald Trump. And this was from a conservative but still credentialed New Testament theologian on a fairly well-known YouTube channel. And I just couldn't watch it. I not because I would ever try to quell open debate about important issues, but I just never thought that this could be a really seriously discussed question. But there is this, not every evangelical or Christian that supports Trump is part of this sect that identifies him as the Messiah, but it's a larger minority than it should be. Where did that come from? Because that's different than just supporting a candidate because you think on the whole the issues they fight for outweigh the character faults. This is identifying him not just as someone who gets the right policies in place. This is identifying him with the Messiah. You can't overlook character flaws in characterizing someone as the Messiah. So where does that come from?
I'm not up on the origins of the New Apostolic movement, but I would say here's an interesting factoid. So Paula White, who's like, I think she's like Trump's head spiritual director or something in the White House, and she's one of these very extreme prophecy charismatics, and she's married to Paul Cain, who's part of the group Journey, who I've seen a couple times in concert over the years. If you remember the song "Don't Stop Believing," right? That's a classic rock band, great rock band. But then that's her link is like she's married to one of the members of the band, or Jonathan Cain. Did I say Paul Cain? Paul Cain's someone different. Yeah, Jonathan Cain, I believe it is. And so anyway, there's some of the things it's related to QAnon. So QAnon still is around, but it continues to change because, of course, with these kinds of movements, they make these prophecies of the end of the world, etc., and the fulfillment of prophecy. And then when those things inevitably don't happen, the prophecies get reworked and then spit out again. And now we've just adjusted the date. Now, of course, like for someone like me, I mean, I grew up in not quite that extreme, but I grew up in that dispensational view that was predicting the end of the world. I remember. So it was very popular in 1988 to believe that Jesus was coming back in 1988 because there was a guy named Edgar Weisnant who published a book, 88 Reasons Why Jesus is Coming Back in 88. And I actually had a friend in high school in September of 88, his parents sold and gave away everything they owned because they were anticipating being raptured in the first week of September or the second week of September. I think it was September 12th. Didn't happen, as you probably know. But those movements have been around for a while. I just think the New Apostolic movement is a further permutation of that. And this is part of, remember I mentioned like the holiness tradition, like Wesleyanism that gave birth to evangelicalism. Well, those also gave birth to the restorationist movements. Like Pentecostalism is a type of restorationist movement. And typically those movements believe the end of the world is coming and God is preparing people for the end of the world by giving new spiritual gifts, like returning the gift of tongues to the church. And so this is a sign of the end of the world. And so I would think that the New Apostolic movement just fits into that kind of far fringe charismatic tradition. But it's very politicized, and I think their rhetoric is often very concerning, and it's often melded with a Christian nationalist impulse. So yeah, it's something to be aware of for sure.
I think the dominant response from reflective Republicans and evangelicals who do acknowledge moral failings on Donald Trump's part and don't think of him as the Messiah is to offer the rationalization that you outlined that while Donald Trump says terrible things, what he does, the policies he enacts are good. So that we have to that what matters far more for the health of the country and its long-term well-being will obviously, and this is true, will obviously be the policies that Donald Trump enacts, not the things that he says in an interview or that he was recorded as saying 15 years ago. It's what he does. And so I recall listening in snippets to Ben Shapiro throughout the election of Donald Trump in 2016 and then throughout his term as president the first time and continuing today prior to the election and today. And it's fascinating to watch this conservative political commentator who, I think it was in 2015 or 2016, published an essay saying why I will never vote for Donald Trump, listing many of the things we've talked about. And to then hear him in 2024 engage in a debate with Sam Harris, where he says, yeah, well, he ended up pretty much acting as a conservative president, enacting conservative policies. And so that is what ought to be the dominant factor in whom we vote for. What is wrong in general with this proposed distinction drawn between the character of the man and the things that he does? I can see several flaws thinking about it abstractly, but I wonder what you think of that justification for supporting Donald Trump.
Look, at this point, the first term is water under the bridge. So rather than go back to the first term, I think we can just pick up the story on January 6th, 2021. On January 6, 2021, Donald Trump led an insurrection. And so what you had there was a couple thousand people stormed into the Capitol to attempt to prevent Congress from ratifying the results of the November election, which would have recognized Joe Biden as president. There were people who beat police officers. There were people calling for the Vice President Mike Pence to be hanged. Mike Pence was there with his child in the Capitol building, and they escaped through the back through some secret tunnel because his life was threatened. There were people shot and killed. And while this was going on for like 2.5 hours, Donald Trump refused to say anything to stop them. And this was, of course, after he had been amping up his followers for months. And in late December, he tweeted to them, go to January 6th, it'll be wild. And on January 6th, only begrudgingly, finally did he tell his goons to pull back. Well, in the wake of that, the Justice Department, they did the largest investigation in American history. And they, among other things, I can actually just pull it up here. They convicted, among others, 172 people pleaded guilty to assaulting law enforcement. 69 pleaded guilty to assaulting law enforcement with a dangerous or deadly weapon. Also, Proud Boys and Oath Keepers were convicted of seditious conspiracy, which is a planned attempt to overthrow the government. On the first day he returned, was reelected, and came back to the presidency in January of this year, 2025, Donald Trump pardons all of these people who beat police officers with clubs. He pardoned them so they could just walk out of prison. The Proud Boys and Oath Keepers who were convicted of seditious conspiracy, he commuted their sentences so they walk free. What that says is this is a person who despises democracy. This is a person who's not afraid to employ violence and to encourage violence in order to retain the presidency. And just 1 week ago, from the moment that we're talking right now, Steve Bannon, so one of Donald Trump's most high-profile supporters and the people closest to him, said they're currently working on getting, although the 22nd Amendment prevents Donald Trump from becoming president a third time, they're currently working on a way to get him president a third time. So just to continue his presidency on in perpetuity. So they're overt about this. So whatever else you want to say, if you don't have a functioning democracy, if you have a wannabe, someone who said himself he'd be a dictator for a day, now that's his way of normalizing conduct and attitudes through quote-unquote joking. But as you could say, if a guy is always joking about killing his wife, he may not kill his wife. But I tell you, there's something pretty disturbing in that pattern of humor, and that time and again reflects Donald Trump. So I'm not really interested in what people have to say about how he's a Republican, which he isn't, by the way. He's a protectionist. He's an interventionist. He's talking about invading countries like Denmark and their territory of Greenland. He's talking about annexing my country, and he's very serious about it. He's threatening NATO members. Think about this. NATO could be placed in a position of having to defend Denmark and Greenland and Canada from this person who's currently threatening to invade them. I mean, like if this was rhetoric coming out of Putin's mouth, right? NATO would be marshaling their forces right now on the eastern borders of Poland. Well, that's what he's now talking about to NATO members. So I cannot be strong enough in telling people they have to take this seriously if they value democracy.
Mm, I agree with you. And I wonder, it almost certainly relates to what we've spoken about now and about social media specifically, that what is the MAGA Republican, or really just the general Republican that voted for Donald Trump, what world are they living in? And I don't mean that condescendingly, I just mean it in the sense of what is their perception of these events, of what to my eyes look like the slow eroding of American democracy. They have an alternative spin on this. They have an alternative interpretation of what's going on. And is the explanation for how they maintain their worldview simply that they just get their information from conservative news sources? Like, is it so skewed that these news networks and these outlets for them on social media are just presenting an alternative history and vision? Is that ultimately what's going on?
Well, I think confirmation bias. I think that there's probably many different cognitive biases at play here that allow people to en- engage in this kind of cognitive dissonance. But I think confirmation bias is certainly one of the most influential. So that's where you have a particular view and you count the evidence and information that supports and reinforces your view, and you downplay or dismiss or ignore evidence that contradicts your view. So if your view is that Trump is a great businessman, then you'll just kind of forget about his six times that he declared bankruptcy as a businessman. You'll forget about the fact that his cumulative wealth is not greater than if he had just taken the money his dad gave him in the early 1970s and just put it in a bank and collected interest. And instead, what you'll look at is, the gold toilets or whatever it is that you're counting. But whatever it is, you'll find something to count that he's a great businessman. Just the image created on The Apprentice for years, that becomes your grid. And of course, we can all do this, right? We all have a confirmation bias that's going to predispose us to look for evidence that supports and reinforces our views. So, but I think that that's very strong, especially when you're in these information bubbles, right? Because they're already doing your work for you of the confirmation bias and minimizing anything that would create the cognitive dissonance or challenge it.
Well, the second factor is undoubtedly true. This single issue voting, where you identify, I take it, one particular policy that's simply non-negotiable, that is so important and so vital that any candidate who supports it has your support if no other candidate does. And it doesn't matter what other moral failings they might exemplify. And one that most people think of is abortion. I think there are others, but abortion is quite the vivid example because there is some surface level plausibility to a single issue voting approach to abortion. If you think that aborting a fetus is equivalent to murder, then it does seem quite consistent with other moral intuitions, generally accepted moral intuitions, that you're going to vote for the person who promises to reduce the practice, outlaw abortion at some level. And I know Donald Trump hasn't ended up doing that, but he did instill 3 Supreme Court justices that helped overturn Roe v. Wade. So there is some justification for seeing Donald Trump as the one who will fight abortion. If we grant those philosophical premises, those ethical premises, there is, I think, at least a strong initial case for a single issue voting approach. What do you think about that as a general point, single issue voting? And what do you think about abortion as the linchpin of why someone would vote for Donald Trump and just ignore all these other issues?
In August of last year, August of 2024, Donald Trump promised to make IVF free for everybody. And now, in vitro fertilization is a very expensive form of artificial reproductive technology. And yet he was promising to use government funds to make it free for everybody. Now, of course, he hasn't done that because, like you said, he's a habitual liar. Actually, let me just say a word about lying before we come back to that. I think this is actually important. I think that Donald Trump is a clinical psychopath. I think there's overwhelming evidence for that, including his habitual lack of truth-telling, including his narcissism, including his lack of moral compassion or a moral compass, including his Machiavellianism and his utilitarian use of other people for his own ends. But in terms of the truth telling part, I actually think he's better viewed as a malignant bullshitter than a malignant liar. And it's not an unimportant difference. So Harry Frankfurt, excuse me, the philosopher, the way he talked about the distinction between bullshitting and lying is that when you lie, you know what the truth is and you want people to believe something that is false instead of the truth. And so you communicate something false to them with the intent they come to believe something false as true. Now, the liar, interestingly, has a significant interest in the truth then and in misrepresenting it. The bullshitter is different. The bullshitter doesn't care what the truth is. They will just say whatever they can in the moment to elicit the effect that they want, whether it's true or not, whether it's even coherent or not. They will use language to elicit effects. Now, an unscrupulous salesperson is a great example of a bullshitter because they'll tell you whatever you want to hear that they think will be successful to manipulate you into buying the product, right? If you're looking to buy a car on the car lot and they'll say, yeah, I just had a couple looking to put an offer on that car an hour ago. Oh, okay, well then I'll put in an offer. And it's not that it's false or that they're lying so much as they're just making stuff up to try to get you to buy the car. And I think Trump's like that. I think that the way he uses language, he's not even interested in its truth value. He's just interested in manipulating people for his own ends. And that's not unimportant because really, as Frankfurt pointed out, that's even more disturbing than a habitual liar. If you are so disconnected with truth, you don't even care what it is. I think that describes Trump to a T. Now, to come back to IVF. So here he's offering IVF, and this is a great example. I think he bullshits all the time in order to manipulate people to get what he wants. And part of them was, oh, you want IVF? Okay, everybody can have IVF. But again, IVF, so for a typical IVF procedure, you're going to fertilize multiple embryos, and then they're going to be put in a bank and frozen, and they may never be used. And for a pro-life person who believes in the absolute value of life from the point of conception, then the death of those is like a murder, every one of them. And plus, you're also, if you're going to implant them, you're going to probably implant 4 of them or 5 of them because more often than not, they don't take. And then if, let's say, 3 of them do, in fact, implant in the uterine wall and begin to develop as fetuses, you'll probably go in and do selective abortions rather than have the greater medical risks of 3 pregnancies. So you think about the death toll that flows from the use of IVF, which for these evangelicals who talk about the Holocaust of abortion every year, well, there's a Holocaust of IVF. And Donald Trump showed in August that he's willing to have a Holocaust of IVF. So if you care about abortion, how could you vote for Donald Trump? It doesn't make any sense. So there's that. But the other thing, and I think evangelicals set them up for this. So this comes back to your question, well, what about abortion as the single issue? Well, the problem is life. I think there's a sacredness to life in utero, but there's also sacredness to life ex utero. After that child is born, that child's life is still sacred. And yet Donald Trump continually devalues and objectifies human beings if they are from particular outgroups that serve his political interests, like refugees, and migrants and immigrants, people with green cards who are non-Caucasian. I said I wasn't going to go back to his first presidency term, but just for a minute, let's remind ourselves that he said we need more immigrants from Norway, not from quote-unquote shithole countries, by which he meant countries like Haiti. And I think it's pretty clear what he means. Norway, for Donald Trump's mind, means a lot of more white people, educated white people. Haiti means like non-white people that are uneducated and dangerous. And I mean, that's, for anybody who values life, I mean, this is horrible rhetoric that he regularly engages in, dehumanizing, objectifying people.
As a Christian myself of an undetermined kind, no longer evangelical or conservative, but just trying to think through things on a case-by-case basis, I look at the situation with American Christianity, and I see a group of people I couldn't possibly identify with. And while I espouse the policy of not throwing the baby out with the bathwater, it's hard to find a home, a place that I could, in good conscience, take part in because of its broader affiliations. I mean, I watched with serene disappointment as William Lane Craig initially opposed Donald Trump, at least covertly and implicitly through various social media posts, and expressed the usual, I think, initial evangelical distaste for the man that you pointed out with Wayne Grudem and others. And then I watched over the years as various podcast topics took political, an increasingly political angle to the point where today William Lane Craig all but endorses Donald Trump and his policies. And he was one of the individuals who espoused this similar argument that, the character of the man is not what matters. It matters what he does. And he illustrated this point with the opposite phenomenon of an individual he thought had outstanding moral character and Christian convictions and then ended up just being a closeted liberal. And he pointed to Jimmy Carter as the bastion of Christianity that Christians thought he would be, but then while in office ended up not enacting the kind of policies that they wanted. And so they ended up rejecting him. And so I see what he's saying, that we want the man that does the things, not the one that says they'll do the things but then don't. But that that it's the issue. It almost, the way he phrases it almost seems like we want someone who walks the walk, not just someone who talks the talk. But he doesn't talk the talk that you should be engaging in. The things he says are morally abhorrent. And then, of course, the things that he does as well are very difficult to square with at least part of a biblical ethic. And I'm not sure where I'm going with this freewheeling set of reflections, but I just felt so disappointed to watch, in particular, this man that I greatly admired and respected take a very dark turn, it seems to me, politically speaking, in pursuit of what in his mind are certain morally justifiable ends. In this case, the ends justify the means. And Craig is someone who will point to abortion as one of those key issues, that we have to fight for the unborn, and so it just is justified to vote for Donald Trump. And it's alarming to see someone you so greatly respect as intellectual and as intelligent and reflective in so many domains. And then comes Donald Trump, and it's like a different mentality in person emerges. And I imagine that there are many Christian leaders that this has happened to. And so I don't think William Lane Craig is unique in this respect. I think that many people like me have experienced this same astounding disappointment and bafflement at the approach that has been taken among Christian leadership.
This whole thing, well, it's don't tell me about the character, tell me about what they do. The irony, of course, is that I'm old enough to remember Bill Clinton when actually character really mattered. Evangelicals say, look, character matters, and Bill Clinton does not have a good character. And I actually agree with that. I think that Bill Clinton was engaged in sexually predatory conduct. I think in some respects he was a lot like Donald Trump. In other respects, not. But yeah, in some respects he was. And Republicans were right to call out some of that conduct. His relationship with Monica Lewinsky, his sexual targeting, grooming of Monica Lewinsky, I think probably those are more appropriate categories in our current understanding of what happened there. They're right to call that out. And his lying under oath, I did not have sex with that woman. But the same goes for Donald Trump, right? And so I think that we can kind of recognize the hypocrisy at play there. And it is kind of disheartening when you have somebody who's, whatever else you think of him, I mean, Bill Craig is a brilliant person, clearly. And the fact that they can have such a truncated moral vision, in my estimation. I mean, even like you talk about Jimmy Carter, maybe there were things that he didn't do that were great. He had a lot of admirable policies as well. I mean, one of them was the attempt to implement renewable energies in the late 70s, he put solar panels on the White House, which Ronald Reagan promptly ripped off in support of the fossil fuel industry. Imagine if the United States had stayed focused on the importance of renewable energies from the late 1970s on, instead of having 12 years of Republicans turfing it. Things would probably be very different, and you'd probably have a better air quality, among other things. And same with Canada, we'd be better off too. So, yeah, he wasn't great in some respects, I'm sure, but Jimmy Carter did have a lot of things that a Christian should have valued. Now, of course, these conservative Christians typically have devalued environmental stewardship because of a dispensationalist expectation in the end of the world. And this view that, so the world's just going to go up in flames anyway, so we don't need to worry about our fossil fuels and rising sea levels, which, of course, I think is a fatal mistake.
Well, going back a step for a moment, one question that I think a lot of people ask is, what is it about Donald Trump that allowed him in 2015, 2016 to say all of the things that he did and yet still have a successful campaign? I think if you went back to the year 2010 and you showed someone a film of Donald Trump mocking a disabled reporter, and you said, do you think that this man then went on to have a successful presidential campaign and win the election? They would have said no. No one could ever have a successful campaign after saying something like that. It would have tanked anybody else. And I think that's right. Why didn't that and everything else tank Donald Trump? Why did he become immune to any sort of consequence for the thing that he says? He seems to have somehow gained the ability to say literally anything free of repercussions to his political viability. Why is that? Why did that happen?
I want to read, people may not remember this, from January 8th of 2017, the Golden Globes, Meryl Streep gave a speech. And she said, in the last year, she said, there was one performance this year that stunned me. And then she goes on. She says, it sank its hooks in my heart. Not because it was good. There was nothing good about it. But it was effective and it did its job. It made its intended audience laugh and show their teeth. And in that moment, when the person asking to sit in the most respected seat in our country imitated a disabled reporter, someone he outranked in privilege, power, and the capacity to fight back. It kind of broke my heart when I saw it, and I still can't get it out of my head. Because it wasn't in a movie. It was real life. And this instinct to humiliate, when it's modeled by someone in the public platform, by someone powerful, it filters down into everybody's life because it kind of gives permission for other people to do the same thing. Disrespect invites disrespect. Violence incites violence. And when the powerful use their position to bully others, we all lose. So that was after Trump mocked Sig Kowalski, I think his name was. I'm not sure what, he has some kind of degenerative condition, and so Trump, he's mocking his hand gestures and movements to a roaring, cheering crowd. I still can't get that out of my head. It's been almost a decade, and I'll never forgive that. I'll never forgive that people laughed at that. What a sickness that is. And then to talk to people who try to rationalize it, say, oh, he wasn't really talking about that reporter. I mean, people will believe what they want to believe. But Meryl Streep was 100% right. The toxic impact of people normalizing that kind of cruelty and malice. He is a cancer on the body politic. It's a very appropriate metaphor in this situation. That kind of hate is cancer, and it's how do people rationalize that and justify that? I can't get into people's heads. But I think that I will say this, that he's created some of that hate, but some of that hate was there, and he just tapped into it and gave it a release and gave people permission. And pardon me, but I've noticed in social media in the last year or two a resurgence of the normalization of the term retard to refer to people. I'm seeing it all the time now. I didn't see that 5 or 10 years ago. And that is just a further example, I think, of the coarsening of discourse with people like Trump and Elon Musk, who are normalizing that kind of hate speech.
So if you were speaking to a group of well-intentioned evangelical Christians that you thought had some possibility of changing their mind, of going a different direction, what would you say to them? What would you say to American evangelicalism uh, if you had a more redemptive angle on it? What are evangelicals to do? What should they do in terms of? I mean, like if I were to have a conversation with a convinced MAGA evangelical, I don't even know where I'd begin. I don't even know what I would say, because everything I'd say would take for granted certain claims or assumptions, often anyway, that these individuals don't share. So here's the more tractable question: is productive dialogue with the convinced MAGA Republican possible?
Yeah, it's predictably, I would say it's going to depend on the person. You know, I've back in high school, I had a moment where I was out with a friend, and then this guy kind of focused on my friend and wanted to fight him. And I used my wit and charm to extricate my friend from that situation. And pretty soon I was like joking with the guy that wanted to fight him. And as a result, I got cocky and I thought, you know, I can reason my way and charm my way out of any situation. So a couple months later, I was in a city park at night, and a group of headbangers, these were a kind of a teenager that used to roam the landscape. They wore skinny, tight jeans and high tops or boots, cowboy boots, and they listened to heavy metal music, had long hair. And a group of them, we ran into them, and my friends got away, and I thought, I'll try my way out of this. And so I started talking to them, and then eventually I got punched in the face. And then again and again, and then I got the crap beat out of me. And eventually we were in the middle of a highway, and they were repeatedly kicking me in the head, and then a semi truck stopped, and that guy, get out of here, and they ran away. And I might have brain damage, right, if that trucker hadn't driven along and stopped them. And something that told me is that lesson I've never forgotten is that you can't charm some people, you can't reason with some people. To borrow from The Dark Knight, some men just want to see the world burn. Right? Not to be overly dramatic, but I think that you do have to decide who are the persuadable people and who are the people that will not be persuaded. I think the good news is that most people probably can be persuaded with significant effort. But the second thing I would say is that once you think this person may be persuadable, is you have to check your own heart, because the degree to which you have contempt or frustration for that other person, they will see it. And the second that they just detect that in you, you've already lost the argument. And this is something I struggle with, because I can have so much frustration and the contempt will show. Well, then it's an aborted effort, right? You've wasted your time because you showed them contempt. So the second thing is, once you identify people you think are persuadable, you can't have contempt for them. You have to have compassion and earnestness and treat them like an intelligent person that you can argue with. And then, from there, I would say just go stepwise and focus on one thing after another and say, look, what do you think about this? And show them documented evidence of something Trump did. And for example, pardoning Ross Ulbricht. So Ross Ulbricht was established the Silk Road, which was major dark web marketplace, and he oversaw the sale of over $200 million worth of drugs on this dark marketplace through cryptocurrency, which made him de facto one of the most prolific people to have an impact on the global drug trade in history, right up there with Pablo Escobar. He was sentenced to life in prison in 2015, and Donald Trump gave him a full pardon in his first week or two of office. Why? Because Trump considers himself the crypto president, I think. He likes cryptocurrency. He has his own Trump coin that he's trying to make money off of people with. And so he pardoned Ross Ulbricht, one of the most prolific, amoral drug dealers in the world. Present that evidence to somebody and say, what do you think about that? Let's just sit on that. the problem is that I find you often confront them with various issues, and they say, well, yeah, okay, I don't know, yeah, I agree, that's not good, but then it doesn't sink in, right? And then they end up, they haven't really changed their views. So I think it's really, what you have to do is focus on things, try to get them to begin to change their views over time, and maybe through a relationship and a lot of time and careful and reasoning without contempt, you can begin to get people to have a different view.
Mm. I want to end on a more hopeful note of beginning with this question about the incompatibility between Christianity and its vision for the world and the actions and policies and vision that Donald Trump has for the world. I've alluded to it briefly by talking about the New Testament ethic of love and compassion. But what is Christianity's vision for the world as you understand it? What does Christianity have to offer for our ethics, for our worldview, for our politics that would be an alternative to what white evangelical Protestants would have us believe? What's the proper way? What is the better formulation of Christianity, and what does it actually say about this vision? Because I'm looking for what I'm looking for is an alternative to what evangelicals would have you believe is the only way Christianity can exist. I think that it partly explains why when someone will object so strenuously to an element of conservative Christianity, they reject the whole thing entirely because they don't know that there are alternative expressions. So this is such an open-ended question, and it's not fair of me to ask you, what is a better way to be Christian, and what does that look like?
Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be filled. Blessed are the merciful, for they will be shown mercy. Blessed are the poor in heart, for they will see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called children of God. Blessed are those who are persecuted because of righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. That's what it looks like. I think it's a very different vision. It's not the gospel of power. It's not the gospel of dehumanizing vulnerable immigrants and refugees, Democrats and feminists and trans people and gays and whoever else you put in the out group. It's the gospel of the cross, right? The taking up your cross daily. So it's not something I live very consistently, though I try, but that's the gospel. And I think it is a very different gospel indeed.
Amen, Randall. Thank you once again for coming on the podcast and having this important conversation. I think people will find it helpful. I think it will contribute to this important conversation. Thank you.
Thanks for having me.